On a quiet morning in New York City, sunlight slipping through the blinds like nothing was wrong, I walked into the living room expecting to see my husband reading the paper, the same routine we'd followed for decades. Instead, he was standing by the door with my suitcase open, my clothes thrown inside, his hands shaking with rage. On the table beside him lay an old envelope, one I had prayed he would never find. He didn't ask a question. He didn't let me speak. He just said, "Get out." If you're watching this, please like the video and subscribe. I still remember the exact moment my whole world cracked open. It was just after sunset, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the kitchen wall. The same clock that had marked every birthday, every argument, every apology in our marriage. I walked into the living room carrying a basket of folded laundry, expecting the usual evening routine. His cigarette by the porch, the news playing too loudly, and me reminding him to turn the volume down. But instead, I found him standing in the middle of the room with a crumpled letter in his hand, his face twisted with a kind of disgust I had never seen directed toward me before. He didn't shout at first, he just stared. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from pure, boiling anger. My hands tightened around the basket because something in his stare told me this was not a moment I could brush aside with a soft voice or a gentle explanation. This was different. This was dangerous. I opened my mouth to ask what was wrong, but he lifted the letter like it was evidence in a crime and said nothing. Silence can hurt more than words, and in that moment it cut through me like a knife. Then, without warning, he exploded. His voice tore through the house. "How long were you planning to lie to me?" He sounded like a stranger in my own home. The sound echoed off the walls, off the memories we had built there, off the love I thought still lived inside him. I stepped back, confused, frightened, trying to understand what he had discovered, what piece of my past had resurfaced without my consent. Before I could take a breath, he shouted again, louder this time, "Get out! I can't look at you. I can't live with someone like you." The basket fell from my hands, clothes spilled across the floor. My knees felt weak as if they couldn't carry the weight of his accusation. For a moment, the world around me turned cold, like winter air had swept into the room, freezing everything inside me. I wanted to speak, to explain, to tell him he didn't understand. But he wasn't listening. He had already decided I was guilty of something he didn't fully know, something he hadn't asked me about, something he hadn't given me a chance to explain. He threw the letter onto the coffee table and pointed at the front door. "Leave," he said. "Right now." His words weren't loud, but they were sharp, cutting, final. For a second, I wondered if this was a nightmare. If I would wake up in our bed beside him and laugh at how real it felt. But the coldness in his eyes told me the truth. He meant it, every cruel word. I slowly bent to pick up one of the shirts that had fallen to the floor. One of his shirts. He stepped forward and kicked it away as if the sight of me touching his things disgusted him. I felt my heart tear in a way I didn't know was possible. I had been his wife for decades. I had stood by him through sickness, through layoffs, through mistakes he made that I never threw back in his face. And yet here he was, kicking me out with no conversation, no compassion, no attempt to understand the truth. My hands trembled as I reached for my coat. He didn't offer help. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at me. The man who once promised to protect me now couldn't bear to stand in the same room I stepped outside, the night air hitting me like a bucket of ice. I heard the door slam behind me, shaking the porch light and sending a message louder than any argument. I was no longer welcome in my own home. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark windows, breathing in sharp, uneven gasps. Tears blurred my vision, but I couldn't even bring myself to cry properly. The pain was too deep for tears. I kept asking myself what exactly he had found, what version of my past he believed, and why he refused to hear the truth from my own mouth. But as I stood in the cold, something inside me shifted. The shock settled into something steadier, something stronger. I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth he thought he knew was not the truth at all, and I would make sure he faced the reality he had tried to run from. When he slammed the door in my face, the sound echoed through my bones. I stood there on the front porch, frozen, the night air colder than it had ever felt in all my years living in that house. I could still hear the anger in his voice, the sharpness of it, the way the word "out" cut through the room like a knife. For a moment, I truly thought my knees would give out beneath me. I had expected him to be shocked, maybe hurt, maybe confused, but not this, never this. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't ask for clarity. He didn't even look me in the eye. He simply read that letter, the one I had kept hidden for decades, and his entire body changed. His face tightened, his jaw clenched, and then came the command, "Get out. I can't live with this." I stood outside the door, the cold wood pressed against my palm, as if I could somehow push my way back into the life I had just been thrown out of. A part of me wanted to scream. Another part wanted to cry, but I didn't do either. I just stood there, stunned, staring at the thin line of warm light bleeding out from under the door. It was the same door I had walked through after giving birth to our son. The same door where he carried me over the threshold when we got married. The same door where we stood together every Christmas morning, holding coffee cups and greeting family. Now, all of that history felt like it had been swept away in a single second. The cold night wrapped around me, stiff and uncaring. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it hurt too much. How could a man who had shared so much life with me treat me like a stranger without even listening to a single word? I took a small step back and looked up at the windows. They were dark, except for the faint glow from the living room. He was inside. He was pacing. I could hear the heavy thud of his feet through the walls. I knew that sound. His angry pacing, the one he always did when he was trying to keep himself from exploding. But even then, even hearing the proof of his rage, I could not understand how he could choose silence over truth. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to steady my breathing. The yard, the one I had taken care of for years, seemed unfamiliar in the moonlight. The flowers I planted in spring were wilted under the night air. The chairs we sat on during warm evenings were empty, shadows stretching across them like long, accusing fingers. Everything felt distant, as if the world itself had stepped back, leaving me alone on a stage where the script had suddenly changed. I wanted to knock on the door again. I wanted to force him to listen. I wanted to shout, "It's not what you think!" But my hand wouldn't move. Something inside me knew that he wasn't ready to hear anything. Not now. Not yet. His silence wasn't just silence. It was rejection, final, cold, clear, the kind you feel deep inside your bones. I slowly stepped away from the porch and walked toward the fence at the edge of the yard. The gravel under my feet crunched with each step, sounding far too loud in the quiet night. I turned back once, hoping, foolishly, that the door might open, that he might come out and say my name the way he used to. That he might soften, even a little, even just enough to let me explain, but nothing happened. The door stayed shut, the light stayed still, and the house, the home I had built with him, stood silent and unmoving, like a judge who had already made up his mind. Standing there, in that heavy quiet, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my past. This wasn't just about a letter. This was about years of things tightening between us. Years of questions never asked, years of emotions swallowed instead of spoken. His explosion tonight was only the final crack in walls that had been weakening for a long time. And so I didn't cry. Not then. Not yet. Instead, I let the silence settle around me like dust, heavy and suffocating. I took a slow breath, the kind that hurts your chest, and whispered to myself, "You can't force someone to hear the truth when they're in love with the lie." I turned away then, walking down the path toward the street, each step slow and heavy. Behind me, the house stayed dark and still. He didn't come out. He didn't call my name. And that silence, that cold, hollow silence, told me everything I needed to know about what would come next. I had spent my whole life building a version of myself that felt safe, respectable, and easy for everyone to accept. But there were parts of my past I had buried so deeply that even I avoided thinking about them. Before I married my husband, before I became a mother, I lived a life that was rougher, more complicated, and filled with choices made out of survival, not comfort. I worked 2 jobs, moved from town to town, and trusted people I shouldn't have trusted. There were relationships that ended badly, debts I struggled to pay, and one person in particular who broke me so deeply that I promised myself I would never speak of him again. When I married my husband, I thought those pieces of my past no longer mattered. I believed I had finally stepped into a life where all the dark corners of my history could be locked away forever. I told myself that being a good wife, a good mother, and a good woman wiped away everything that came before. But marriage comes with expectations, even silent ones. My husband always asked about my past, where I lived before, who I had dated, why some years of my life seemed blank. When he gently asked about them, I couldn't tell him the truth then. I was afraid he would see me differently. I was afraid he would look at me not as the woman he loved, but as the woman I used to be. So I gave him half answers, soft explanations, and quiet smiles. He never pushed, but I knew he noticed the gaps. Whenever the topic came close, I changed the subject or excused myself. At the time, I convinced myself that I was protecting us both. After all, what good would it do to bring old wounds into a peaceful home? But secrets have weight, and even when buried, they leave cracks. Over the years, my husband would sometimes look at me with a strange expression, like he felt there was a part of me he could never reach. And he was right. I had built a wall around the years I wanted to forget, sealing them away with silence. I thought that silence was enough to keep everything hidden. I didn't know that the past I tried so hard to bury would one day be dug up by someone else, someone who wanted to hurt me or hurt us both. It started with old documents I had kept in a locked box. Not because I wanted to revisit them, but because throwing them away felt like erasing the young girl I used to be. Among those papers were letters from a man I once trusted, a man who turned into a nightmare I barely survived. There were photographs from a time when I wandered from place to place, searching for stability. There were records of debts I struggled to clear before marriage, debts my husband never knew existed. I thought the box was hidden well, tucked in a place he would never look. I was wrong. Someone else found it first. An old friend from my past, someone who had known my secrets and had reasons to use them against me, came across my husband earlier that week. I didn't know it then, but she had reached out to him, stirring doubts, suggesting I had lied to him for years. She gave him pieces of the truth, twisted just enough to sound like a betrayal. I had no idea this conversation had happened. I didn't know the seed of mistrust had already been planted. So when my husband eventually found the box, left out of place because someone else had touched it, he wasn't just surprised. He felt tricked, misled, even humiliated. All the missing details, all the moments where I avoided explaining, suddenly made sense to him in the worst possible way. And because he discovered it without hearing my side first, his mind filled in the blanks with fear and anger. I remember the sound of his footsteps that night, heavy and uneven, pacing through the hallway as he went through the contents of the box piece by piece. I remember sitting in bed, wondering why the house felt colder, why something felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. I didn't know then that he had read the letters. I didn't know he had seen the photographs. I didn't know he had pieced together a version of my life that made him feel betrayed. Before I could explain that my past was filled with pain, not deception. Before I could tell him I hid those years because I was ashamed, not because I wanted to lie. He made his judgment, and by the time he confronted me, anger had already swallowed any chance of reason. I had always feared the day my past would return. I just never thought the person who would punish me for it would be the man I trusted most. When I look back now, I realize the truth had been revealing itself in small, almost invisible pieces long before the night he threw me out. It didn't happen in one explosion of anger. It happened slowly, quietly, like water dripping through a crack until the whole wall gives way. I didn't understand it then, but now every small clue feels like a warning I failed to hear. At the time, I simply told myself we were getting older, getting tired, getting distant in ways all couples do, but I see now that the small things were the beginning of our trust falling apart. It started with the questions. He would ask casual little things at dinner about my past, about old friends, about places I had lived before him. His tone was always light, almost joking, but there was a sharpness underneath, a searching that made me pause. I remember stirring a pot of soup one evening when he asked, "Where did you say you worked before we married?" He asked it like it didn't matter, but he stared at me too long, like he was waiting for me to slip. I brushed it away, thinking he was just tired from work. Then came the letters. He found them in an old storage box, letters I hadn't touched in decades. He didn't tell me he saw them. I learned because he started watching me differently. He would glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking, studying my face, as if trying to match the woman in front of him. With the words he had read, I began to feel like I was living in a house filled with mirrors. Everything I did reflected back at me with questions behind it. I tried to act normal, but something between us was shifting, quietly and dangerously. He changed in other ways too. His voice became more distant, polite, instead of warm. He stopped touching my hand when we sat together. He went to bed earlier, or sometimes later, lying awake on his side of the bed. Once, I woke up at 2 a.m. and saw him sitting on the edge of the mattress, staring at the wall like he was trying to gather courage to ask something. When I whispered his name, he pretended to be asleep, but I knew he wasn't. His breathing was too fast, too uneven. Little things around the house started moving. Papers on his desk, boxes in the garage, drawers I knew he had never opened before. He was searching, quietly digging into a past I had worked so hard to bury because it hurt too much to revisit. But he didn't ask me. He didn't sit with me. He didn't say, "I found this and I'm confused." Instead, he chose silence, letting suspicion grow like a weed in his mind, wrapping itself around everything good we had built over the years. There were moments when I felt the tension even in the air. At breakfast, he would stare at his coffee instead of speaking. When I asked if something was wrong, he would give a small shrug and say, "Nothing." But his eyes said everything. They were eyes that no longer looked at me with trust. They looked at me like they were searching for lies. Our friends began to notice too. During dinners, he acted distant, answering questions with short responses, barely joining in conversations. One friend pulled me aside afterward and whispered, "Is everything okay between you two?" I smiled and said yes, because I didn't want to admit that my marriage, which had lasted more than half my life, was starting to crack like a thin sheet of glass under too much weight. He also became protective over his phone. He used to leave it anywhere, on the counter, on the table, on the bed. But suddenly, it was always in his pocket, always face down, always with the sound turned off. He changed his passwords too. When I asked why, he said everyone does it now. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. It told me he didn't want me knowing what he was doing. And yet, he had no problem digging into my private past without a second thought. The biggest clue came a few weeks before he kicked me out. He came home late and smelled of cigarette smoke, though he didn't smoke. His hands were trembling slightly and his eyes were red, not from crying, but from anger, burning like he had learned something he wished he hadn't. He didn't speak to me that night. He just walked past me, went to the bedroom, closed the door, and stayed there until morning. When I asked if everything was okay, he simply said, "We'll talk soon." But that talk never came. Instead, silence continued to grow between us, forming a thick wall. Every small clue, every strange behavior, every cold look, they built a path that led straight to the night he threw me out. The truth was creeping toward us like a shadow we both ignored, and by the time it reached our home, it was too late to stop it. And now, I wonder every day, if I had seen the signs earlier, could I have saved us? Or was this betrayal waiting to happen all along? The days after he kicked me out were some of the hardest I have ever lived through, and I have lived through a lot in my years. I slept on my sister's couch, my clothes folded in a small bag at my feet, my mind racing every minute. I could barely eat. I replayed his words over and over again until they echoed inside my head like a drum. Get out. I can't live with this. I kept touching the old scar on my palm, the one I got on the night tied to that past he had discovered, the past I had tried so hard to protect our family from. I had never felt so small, so exposed, so stripped of dignity, but the worst part was yet to come. 3 days later, my sister brought me to a family gathering because she believed it would help. You need to breathe, she told me. You need people around you. I didn't want to go, but I also didn't want to sit alone with the thoughts that kept tearing me apart, so I agreed. When we walked into the community hall, people were laughing, greeting each other warmly, sharing stories over coffee and casseroles. But as soon as I stepped in, the room seemed to tilt, as if all eyes were subtly turning my way. I tried to focus on my granddaughter talking about her school project, but then I saw him, my husband, standing in the corner with 2 of our neighbors. He looked tense, his arms folded, his jaw tight. Then one of them glanced directly at me, whispered something in his ear, and he shook his head violently. I froze. Something was wrong. Then it happened, the moment I will never forget. He walked straight across the room toward me, and instead of speaking quietly, instead of showing even a drop of compassion or restraint, he raised his voice loud enough for half the room to hear. "Why are you even here?" he said coldly. "After everything you hid from me?" The chatter around us died instantly. Every face turned. I felt my knees weaken. I opened my mouth to respond, but he continued. "You lied to me for years. You hid your past like it never happened. And I'm supposed to just pretend?" His voice cracked at the end, but not from sadness, from anger. My face burned with humiliation. I could feel the weight of judgment from every direction. My sister tried to step in between us, but he brushed her off. "No," he said, shaking his head. "She needs to hear this. Everybody should know." His voice trembled with fury, but there was something else there too. Insecurity, confusion, fear. But none of that softened the blow. People whispered. Someone gasped. Someone else murmured, "What did she do?" It was like being stripped naked in front of a crowd. I felt exposed, ashamed, but also angry. Angry because he had no idea what that past had cost me. Angry because he had taken the one moment that should have remained between husband and wife and thrown it into the street, into the eyes of people who would twist it, exaggerate it, and judge me with no understanding. Angry because he didn't even give me a chance to explain. My hands shook so badly that my sister had to hold my arm. I wanted to leave, but my legs refused to move. My husband kept talking, not yelling now, but speaking in a tight, pained tone. "All these years," he said, "I thought we were honest with each other, and you pretended. You built this life on secrets." Pretended. Secrets. He had no idea how wrong he was. He didn't know the truth behind that past, the danger, the pain, the sacrifice I had made to protect someone who didn't deserve the blame. I had carried that burden alone, thinking it was better to protect the peace of the home we had built. I thought hiding the past was kindness, not betrayal. But now, in a room full of staring eyes, I felt like a criminal. I finally found my voice. "Please," I whispered, "this isn't the place." He cut me off. "The place? After what I found, there is no right place. You should have told me years ago." His tone made something crack inside me. Not guilt, not fear, but a kind of awakening. He didn't want the truth. He wanted a reason to be angry. He wanted the world to see me fall apart so he could justify throwing me out. For the first time, I realized that his humiliation wasn't accidental. It was intentional. A way to punish me before he even heard the full story. My sister finally pulled me back, shielding me with her arm. "That's enough," she snapped at him. "If you want answers, you ask like a man, not like this." The room remained tense, the air thick enough to choke on. I saw something flicker across his face. Doubt. regret, but only for a second. Then he turned away, muttering something under his breath as he stormed out. People avoided my eyes, pretending not to have heard, not to have enjoyed the show, but I could feel their judgment like knives. As my sister led me outside, the cold air hit my face and tears finally slipped down my cheeks. Not because of the past, not because of the secret, but because the man I had trusted for decades had chosen the world over me. And that pain, that public humiliation, was the moment everything changed inside me. When I finally found the courage to uncover everything he had seen, the truth came at me all at once, like a wave I was not ready to drown under. I went back to the house the next morning, even though he had kicked me out without a second thought. My hands were shaking when I opened the small box I had hidden for years. The box that held the past he had judged without understanding. I sat on the porch steps, staring at the contents that had now destroyed my marriage. Old letters, photographs, and signed documents from a life I had kept locked away because I believed those years were dead and buried. I thought keeping them hidden would protect my family. Instead, that silence had become the match that burned everything down. The truth was simple but painful. Before I met him, before I became his wife and the mother of our children, I had been in a situation that nearly cost me my life. I had been young, scared, and manipulated by a man who controlled every corner of my world. Leaving him had taken everything, my money, my safety, and almost my sanity. When I finally escaped, I rebuilt myself from the ground up. I worked, I healed, I created a life I could be proud of. And when I met my husband, I thought I had finally found a safe place to exist. I never thought the ghost of my past would return in the form of a misunderstanding, torn open by a man who never took the time to ask why. Inside the box were letters from my former partner, begging, threatening, apologizing, and manipulating. There were police reports documenting the nights I had slept in shelters. There were hospital discharge papers from when I had been hurt so badly that I could barely stand. When I married my husband, I chose not to tell him because I didn't want him to see me as broken. I didn't want him to see the fear, the shame, or the memories I had spent years burying. I thought the woman he knew, the strong, warm, stable woman, was the only version of me he needed to see. But what he had found was incomplete. A single letter, taken out of context, sounding like I had willingly kept another man in my life, sounding like secrets and betrayal rather than protection and survival. He didn't read the rest. He didn't give me the chance to explain. He didn't pause long enough to understand the years of pain behind that single piece of paper. Instead, he let anger guide him. Instead, he kicked me out. As I sat there on the porch, holding the documents that told the real story, I felt a mix of anger, heartbreak, and a hollow ache that seemed to grow with every breath. The truth that I had buried so deeply was now the only thing that could save or end my marriage. And the most painful part was knowing that he had already made up his mind about me without hearing a single word of my side. I took out the letter he had seen, the one written in desperation by a man I had hoped never to think about again. The words on the page felt like poison, but I forced myself to read them with clear eyes. I realized instantly how damaging it must have looked. Without the full story, anyone would have misunderstood. I understood his shock. I understood his confusion. But what I didn't understand was his choice. How quickly he had thrown me out. No questions asked, no discussions, no trust. For decades, I had been his wife. I had raised his children. I had handled every crisis, supported every dream, survived every hardship beside him. And yet, the second he found something he didn't understand, he chose anger over truth. He chose judgment over compassion. He chose to hurt me instead of listening. As the hours passed, I dug deeper through the box, reading old notes I had written during therapy sessions, letters I never sent, reminders of the person I used to be. Each piece broke me a little more and strengthened me at the same time. I realized that my past didn't make me weak. Surviving it made me strong. And now, facing this betrayal from the man who promised to stand beside me, for better or worse, made me see that some people only stay for the better and run from the worse. By the time I finished reading everything, my tears had dried, my hands were steady, and I knew the truth had finally come out. Not just for him, but for me. I had spent my whole life hiding the parts of myself that hurt, believing that protecting others from my pain would make relationships stronger, but secrets, even the ones kept for love, always find their way back. And now, the truth he feared was nothing compared to the truth he never bothered to learn. I hadn't betrayed him. I had survived long before him, and I would survive after him too. I sat alone that night, numb and shaking, staring at the door he had slammed shut in my face. The cold air outside felt kinder than the man I had shared a life with. I knew I couldn't stay frozen forever. I had to act, and I had to act fast. Every second I waited made the situation heavier, more dangerous for my dignity, my security, and my future. I needed help, not emotional comfort, but strategy, clarity, and protection. So I called the only person who had watched my life from the edges without judgment. My sister. She arrived before sunrise, her face tight with worry, but steady with determination. She didn't ask me to defend myself, didn't tell me to calm down. She simply sat beside me and listened as I told her everything. The past I had buried, the secret he found, and the way he threw me out like I was a stranger. As I spoke, the truth became clearer. I had never hidden my past to deceive him. I had hidden it because it was painful, complicated, and tied to survival. My sister reminded me of all the years I spent rebuilding my life, shaping myself into the woman I became, long before he entered the picture. She told me I had a right to my story, even the parts that hurt. Her steady presence gave me courage I didn't know I still had. She urged me not to beg for understanding or forgiveness. She told me to show him facts, proof, and the real context behind the past he had twisted into betrayal. We gathered everything: old documents, letters, legal papers, and testimonies tied to the part of my life he had discovered. My sister knew a lawyer, a quiet but firm woman who agreed to meet us that same afternoon. I walked into her office trembling like a leaf, afraid of the judgment I expected, but she examined every document, every detail, and then looked at me with calm certainty. She explained clearly what my husband had misunderstood, and what he had no right to judge. She helped me gather the papers into a single folder that told the full truth of my past, the truth he never gave me a chance to explain. With every step, I felt a strength rising inside me that I had forgotten existed. The lawyer helped me prepare a statement, not a confession, but a timeline, a set of facts, a story of survival that no one could twist anymore. She warned me that some men lash out because they feel control slipping away, and I needed protection for myself and the assets I had helped build. She advised me to temporarily freeze joint accounts, to secure valuables, and to make a written record of the night he kicked me out. My sister stayed by my side through every decision. I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was acting out of necessity. I had given this marriage decades of love, labor, and loyalty. I wasn't going to let it crumble on a misunderstanding or a secret taken out of context. I needed him to hear me, not through tears, not through pleading, but through proof. My sister said something that stayed with me. You're not fighting for him. You're fighting for yourself, for your truth. By evening, the folder lay in my lap, heavy but steady, the weight of my real story. My sister placed her hand over mine, grounding me. I was ready to face him, not as a broken wife, begging for understanding, but as a woman, reclaiming her voice. Tomorrow would be the confrontation, the moment everything changed. But tonight, I felt something new. Not fear, not anger, but purpose. I had allies, I had clarity, and I had a plan. When I finally gathered everything, the letters, the documents, the photos, the timelines, the truth I had kept buried for decades, I knew I could not put this moment off any longer. My hands were shaking as I placed each piece of evidence into a simple folder. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I knew that the man waiting on the other side of the door was not the same man who had held my hand in our tiny first apartment, or carried our newborn son into the house with trembling excitement. No. The man inside was angry, hurt, and convinced he had been betrayed. And the only way to break through that wall of rage was to show him everything. No more secrets, no more shadows, no more half-truths. Just the truth, heavy and painful, laid bare in the quiet of our living room. I walked in slowly. He was sitting in his armchair, staring blankly at the TV, though it wasn't even turned on. His jaw was tight and his chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths. It was the breathing of a man preparing for another fight. When he heard my footsteps, he didn't even look up. That hurt more than all the shouting had I stood in front of him and placed the folder on the table. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could hear the clock ticking behind me, each second stretching into a lifetime. "I need you to listen," I said, my voice steady, even though my heart felt like it was breaking for the second time in 1 week. He didn't answer. He didn't nod. He didn't breathe any quicker. But his eyes flicked to the folder, a small gesture, but enough to push me forward. I opened it slowly. I did not push it toward him. I needed him to reach for the truth on his own. Inside were the letters he had found, the ones I thought I had burned years ago. There were also documents, real ones, explaining why I had kept that part of my past hidden. My childhood had not been easy. My family had suffered things no one should suffer, and there were choices I had made back then to survive. Choices I had never been proud of. Choices I didn't think anyone, especially him, would ever understand. Everything you saw, everything you think you know, it's only half the story, I said softly. This, I tapped the folder, is the full truth, my truth. He scoffed, a cold, bitter sound. Truth? You lied to me for years. His words fell like bricks on my chest, but I did not back down. I had prepared myself for cruelty. Betrayal teaches you to expect pain from the people you once trusted the most. I didn't lie to hurt you, I replied. I hid it to survive, to move forward, to protect the family we built. He finally met my eyes, and in those eyes, I saw the confusion, the heartbreak, the wounded pride. I saw a man who wasn't just angry at the secret, but at the idea that he had been left out of my pain. I pushed the folder a little closer to him. You can believe me, I said, my voice growing firmer, or you can stay angry at a version of me that never existed. But if you walk away from this, if you refuse to read, refuse to understand, then you're choosing the lie over the truth. He looked away, jaw tight again. He wasn't ready, not yet. So I continued. I'm giving you a choice, I said. Not begging, not explaining again, not trying to soften the truth. Just a choice. Read all of it, understand all of it, and then decide who I am. Decide if you want this marriage, this home, this life. But if you refuse to look, if you refuse to even try, then I will walk away. His eyes snapped back to mine, shocked. He never thought I would say such words. He thought I would keep apologizing, keep shrinking, keep trying to fix something he hadn't even given me space to explain. But the strength I had found, the strength that had pushed me to gather the documents, to stand in front of him now, came from the knowledge that my dignity was worth just as much as his hurt. This is my truth, I repeated slowly. You can believe me, or not. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. For a long minute, he didn't move. He didn't reach for the folder. He didn't speak. But I could see something shifting behind his eyes, the beginning of doubt, of understanding, maybe even the softest spark of regret. And in that moment, I knew the balance had finally shifted. I was no longer the woman standing outside with a suitcase, begging for someone to listen. I was a woman standing tall, offering the truth, not pleading, not hiding, and demanding respect. What he chose next would shape everything that followed. But for the first time in days, I felt a spark of power return to me, quiet, steady, and unbreakable. The moment finally came, when my husband had to face the truth I had placed in front of him. All the documents, all the context, all the explanations he had refused to listen to before were now laid out in a quiet, undeniable line on our dining table. For the first time since he had kicked me out, he wasn't yelling, he wasn't crying, and he wasn't pacing around the room. He simply stood there, motionless, staring down at the pages that revealed everything he thought he understood and everything he had misunderstood. His silence wasn't comforting. It wasn't peaceful. It felt like a storm gathering behind a closed door, full of questions he didn't know how to ask and answers he didn't believe he deserved. I stood across from him and watched the truth settle into his eyes, slowly changing the shape of his anger, turning it into something heavier, something closer to guilt. He didn't apologize. He didn't reach for me. He didn't try to explain himself. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down with the weight of a man who had spent years believing he had been wronged, only to learn he had hurt the very person who had protected him for decades. I waited, standing quietly, giving him the space he needed. I wasn't hoping he would ask for forgiveness. I knew forgiveness was not something I could give easily, not after being cast out like a stranger because of a past that had nothing to do with betrayal. He wasn't ready to admit his blame, and I wasn't ready to soothe his guilt. We were two people who had shared a life, and now we were two people standing on different sides of a truth too heavy for either of us to carry alone. He looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not love, not hatred, not suspicion. It was something closer to confusion, the kind that comes when a person suddenly realizes they have destroyed something without meaning to. He had built his anger around assumptions, and now the foundation of those assumptions had collapsed beneath him. I could see him struggling to understand how he had let fear and judgment lead him into such a cruel choice. He had kicked me out of our home, humiliated me, and broken the very trust he claimed to value. And now the consequences were sitting before him, not as punishment, but as truth. I felt no comfort watching him struggle. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel redeemed. I simply felt tired. Tired of defending myself. Tired of carrying secrets alone. Tired of being punished for things that had been part of a life I lived long before I met him. I realized then that even if he forgave me, even if he begged me to come home, something fundamental had changed. The safety I once felt around him had vanished the moment he slammed the door behind me and refused to listen. I understood now that trust wasn't only about honesty. It was also about patience and understanding and the willingness to hear a truth even when it is uncomfortable. He had failed every one of those tests. He finally spoke. But his words were simple. They weren't an apology. They weren't an explanation. They were just a breath of acceptance. He whispered that he needed time, time to think, time to understand, time to rebuild himself before he even attempted to rebuild anything with me. And I nodded, because I needed time too, time to heal, time to forgive myself for secrets I had carried alone, time to accept that the man I had loved for so long wasn't the man who stood before me now. He was someone older, someone broken by his own judgments, someone who had to live with the consequences of pushing me away. We stayed in the same room, but in separate worlds. The papers between us were the bridge, but neither of us stepped onto it. Not yet. There was no shouting, no begging, no promises, just silence. A heavy silence that said our future would never look like our past. I wasn't sure if reconciliation was possible, and he didn't ask for it. Instead, we agreed, without words, to move forward carefully. Separate rooms, separate routines, quiet observation, a slow rebuilding, not of love, but of understanding. The marriage we once had was gone. What remained was something new, fragile, cautious, shaped by truth rather than trust. When I left the room, I didn't feel defeated or triumphant. I simply felt steady, strong, clear. I had faced the storm, held my ground, and shown the truth. Whether he chose to keep me in his life or not was no longer the center of my world. I had learned something deeper, that healing can begin even when the relationship may not survive, and that sometimes acknowledging the truth is the only resolution you need. After everything that happened, I found myself sitting alone in the quiet of my new room, thinking about how fast a life can change. One moment, I was a wife living in what I believed was a stable marriage, built on trust and years of shared memories. The next moment, I was standing outside my own home, shaken, confused, and forced to carry truths I had tried to bury for decades. The silence that followed all of it became a place where I had to face everything, my past, my choices, and the consequences that came with them, and it was heavier than anything I had carried before. But slowly, as the days passed, I started to understand that pain, even when sharp and unforgiving, can open the door to clarity. I spent many nights thinking about the secret that started everything. I had kept it hidden, not because I wanted to deceive, but because I wanted to protect the people I loved from pain. Back then, I believed that silence was the safest path. I believed that hiding the truth was better than watching my family crumble. But the moment my husband found out, and the moment he reacted without giving me a chance to explain, I realized that secrets, no matter how old, do not disappear. They wait, they sit quietly, and eventually they demand to be faced. I had spent years trying to outrun mine, not understanding that it was following me step by step. The days after he kicked me out were some of the hardest I had ever lived. I questioned everything, my worth, my choices, and the meaning of loyalty. I even questioned whether love meant anything at all if it could be shattered by a single discovery. I felt betrayed by the person who once promised to stand by me. But slowly, another truth surfaced. He was not the only one hurting. I had lived with the weight of my secret, and that weight had shaped my silence. I had been protecting him, but I had also been protecting myself, afraid that the truth would destroy everything. And in the end, it did. But that destruction forced me to see things clearly for the first time in years. When I finally gathered the courage to share everything, to explain the context, the pain, the reasons behind the choices I made, I watched my husband struggle to understand. His anger had come from shock. His reaction had come from fear. And while none of it excused the way he treated me, I could finally see that he was a man caught between love and confusion. People are not perfect. Even the ones we trust the most can fail us, just like we can fail them. What mattered now was what came after the truth, not the storm that delivered it. As I reflected on everything, I realized that I had spent most of my life avoiding conflict, hiding anything that might shake the peace of the household. I had been the kind of woman who held every burden quietly. But this moment forced me to grow in ways I never expected. I learned that truth has its own power. It can hurt, yes, but it can also rebuild what was broken. When spoken at the right time, truth can open doors that fear keeps closed. My truth didn't destroy me. It freed me. It allowed me to reclaim my voice, my dignity, and the strength I had forgotten I had. Slowly, with time and painful conversations, I began rebuilding my life. I learned to forgive myself for hiding the truth and to forgive him for reacting out of shock. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It simply means releasing the grip that pain holds on your heart. I realized that we all carry wounds, and sometimes those wounds create more wounds. I understood that what happened wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was a story of two people drowning in fears they never spoke aloud. In the quiet that followed, I also learned something else. That healing does not come from others. It comes from facing yourself, understanding your past, and deciding how to move forward. I learned that secrets have consequences, but so does silence. Sometimes the most painful truth is still better than the softest lie. I learned that love can fail, but it can also be rebuilt with honesty and patience. And I learned that my strength did not come from being perfect. It came from confronting my imperfections. Now, when I look back, I ask myself, should I have told him everything earlier? Would the pain have been less? Maybe. Or maybe things would have fallen apart sooner. I will never know. But what I do know is this. The past cannot be changed, but the future can be rebuilt. One honest step at a time. And that is the question I leave with you, the one I still ask myself some nights. If you had a secret that could hurt the person you love most, would you tell them right away, or would you wait, hoping it never rises to the surface? Because sometimes a single truth can destroy a life, but sometimes it can save one.